Let me just piggyback a little bit with Ryan and some of the things that he shared this morning. Sometimes that which in missions, sometimes you think what's going on is only what you see. Okay, and or that the things that get the attention here at church and things that there's certain people or that it's limited. And what I want to share with you this morning in this way is that you'd be amazed at what's going on behind the scenes that you don't see. In ways in which people are engaged and people are active and people are doing and serving in a variety of ways. And Aruna is one example. Obviously Ryan and Tom went with him on. Tom's specialty is logistics. He worked for Procter & Gamble doing logistics. So it's logistics, how to move products. But in other ways, the video is done by Adam Hildebrand, who comes here to church. Some of the paperwork's done by somebody else who does graphic design and website. There are other people who are engaging in a whole host of ways, in a variety of ways, using skills and abilities and you can engage by running or walking. Okay. That's just one. Steve mentioned prayer for Pavel and the church in Vidin, and a while back we talked about some of the difficulties that they were going through, and economics there in Vidin are very, very difficult there in Bulgaria. And so there's been a group that's been working very diligently at putting together a business plan and a model now and raising capital for a fish farm there in Vidin, okay, to do fish farming. Except they're raising eel, not my cup of tea, but that's all right, okay? So Henry Vandenberg and Todd Geist and others working together and now in the process of raising capital and doing that as a business's mission there in Vidin for not only for Pavel and for his family, but others. And then hopefully, Lord willing, maybe sustainable economic impact for the sake of the gospel there in that area of Bulgaria. If you want to know more, talk to him about it. You want to talk to him more about Ryan, about Somerset Exports, talk to him and share about how you can engage in a variety of ways, opportunities. We talk about the DR and going to the Dominican Republic and had a team just go. But there are people who've been active in doing stuff with the DR even without having ever seen it. You have people who have done structural engineering and site planning and logistics and all, doing a whole host of different ways, using skills that they have right here to go. Ryan mentioned the bags. Hey, ladies, the design for that bag that these ladies are making in India was designed by a lady in our church. So it's a prototype for that and put it together using sewing skills. Wow. Variety of skills. You like to cook? Jim Dudley said he could use you on, they've got so many international students now that come for dinner for a Bible study on Friday evenings. They don't have enough food. They need people who can help prepare a meal for them. What an opportunity. So there are people engaging, and he said there are a lot of people doing that. They just need more. There are lots of ways to engage in mission and in missions other than just getting on the plane and going, okay? And so let me encourage you to find those ways that you can engage and get involved in what God is doing in the hearts and minds of people, but through Faith Bible Church as it's touching particular areas of the world in a variety of ways. And let me encourage you to think about how you can engage and be a part of that. Take your Bible and go to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth. Just one other side note. Somebody asked me last week, sent me a text message and asked me if this was my favorite Super Bowl commercial. And I had to admit I hadn't watched the commercial. And so he said, here, you've got to watch this text. He said, here's the link. You got to watch this. And so it was, I'd say it was probably my favorite commercial. It was of rebellious colonists on a ship who were throwing boxes of tea off. And the English come by and say, why are you so mad? And they said, what if you could file your taxes for free? Yeah, we wouldn't be so angry, you know. And just think, if we'd have offered them TurboTax back in the 1700s, you guys would have been celebrating the 63rd ascension of the Queen of England just like me this week. Okay? 63 years she's been queen. Wow. The world's been through all kinds of things. But here's the things that you look at it, so how history would be different. And again, sometimes what we see and how we evaluate and how we measure things is only by what we see in the present. And we've got to move away from that. We have a God who's doing things beyond what we see with our eyes. Now, the Book of Ruth is a book that will highlight that for us. Now, the Book of Ruth is really a love story, too. When I was a teenager, there was a film that was the blockbuster hit, and it was called Love Story. You remember that? Some of you go, yeah, I remember that. That means you're as old as I am. Others are absolutely clueless. That's okay. Okay, Eric Siegel's work, his book, and with Ryan O'Neal and Ali McGraw playing the lead role, and it's this fantastic story of two college students who fall in love and the difficulties, but love story. So this is a better love story than Eric Siegel's. Okay? But it's a love story because it really unfolds for us God's plan for loving us and redeeming us too. The greatest love story is here in the Book of Ruth. Okay? And it's, again, one of these things that you don't see, but it's there. Ruth is placed in the English Bible after the book of Judges, and probably there because it takes place during the Judges. In fact, as you open chapter 1, it says this takes place during the period of the Judges. So if you're there in chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. Famine probably, if you remember last week, that the cycle in the book of Judges is the people wander away, idolatry, they sin. God says, you're going to sin, you're going to disobey, you're going to break your covenant with me, I'll bring hardship upon you. There's discipline, usually affliction and oppressors of a variety of sorts. And then God raises up, the people cry out to him and say, please give us relief. God brings a judge on the scene who gives them victory over those particular oppressors and gives them rest for a little while. And then they go back in the cycle again. And so this takes place during the period of the Judges. And there's a famine in the land, which means it's probably during one of the times where there's this period of oppression. It may be the time of the Midianites, for example, in the time of Gideon, where it was very, very difficult. But it's placed here because it takes place in the period of the Judges. But it also then is a transition. It starts to set the table for what's going to come in 1 Samuel. So in our English Bible, they've placed it here. In the flow of the storyline. In a Hebrew Bible, it's not necessarily here. The Hebrew Bible is arranged a little differently, and how the books are grouped together is different than it is in our English Bible. And it's placed in a place that some think that it is descriptive of what is in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 talks about a woman of excellence, a virtuous woman, and that Ruth then follows on the heels of that as an example of a woman who is virtuous, who is a woman of excellence, whose price is far more above rubies. Okay? Well, in either case, I think there's this setting of Ruth and that story is because God is at work. God is at work in his storyline of redemption. What he's going to do in redeeming people and how he goes about it. I'm not going to read it. First, I already read the first chapter, and so I'm not going to do that. I'll just highlight a couple of things out of it for you. But let's summarize the story for you. If you're not familiar with the story of Ruth, it says that here it was in this time period, there's a famine in the land, and there's a man, his name is Elimelech, and that means my God is king. He and his wife Naomi live in the city of Bethlehem, which means a house of bread, but there's no bread. There's the famine. There's no food. So they leave. And they leave and they go to Moab. And we can look at this and we can see as what's unfolding. You say, well, God wasn't happy with them. They should have stayed in Bethlehem. They should have trusted God. Their faith was lacking. And look, God brought judgment upon them because Elimelech died. And his two sons married women from Moab. And they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have married women from another place. And so God judged them, and Mahlon and Chilion, they died. And they don't have any kids. And we can look at it and say, wow, man, this is a story of disobedience and God's judgment, just like the book of Judges. But I don't want us to dwell there, because it's more than that. It's more than that. And I don't know how to judge all the things that are happening by what I sometimes see or what they saw in the present. Well, Naomi hears word that there's bread, there's now relief in the land, and so she goes back to Bethlehem. And her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, are going to go with her. Now, they didn't have any children. So here is Ruth, who's a widow, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, who's a widow, and they have no means of protection or means of provision. And as they go back, the two daughter-in-laws are going back with her. And she says to them in verse 12 of chapter 1, "Go home, return. I'm too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and could bear children, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying?" Now, what she's referring to there is, there's a principle, we see it in the Old Testament, it's something called a levirate marriage, where if somebody died, if a man died and was childless, that his brother would help his wife conceive a child, that he would have an heir, that the man who died could have an heir, could have a descendant, could take over, and then that was a means to provide for the care for his wife. As a widow. And you see that in the Old Testament. You see it on a number of occasions. And so Naomi says, look, I don't have, number one, I don't have any more sons. I don't have any sons that I can take you back and you can marry to raise up a line. And if I went home tonight and I got married tonight, and I'm an old lady, if I was able to have kids, would you wait long enough for those boys to be at a point to marry? She said, no, don't, go on home. This is what she says. "No, my daughters, it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." Now, I want you to think about that. The hand of the Lord has gone against me. God has left me. God has forsaken me. God is heaping hardship on me. The last person you want to be around is me. God has left me. God is not at work. They lifted up their voices, wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. That word cling is that word we talked about before. It's a word that you see in Deuteronomy where it says, cling to the Lord. And I told you then that it's the same word in Genesis 2, where husbands are to cleave to their wives. It's a covenantal clinging to a promise. She clings to her. And Naomi says, look, your sister-in-law's gone back, and why don't you go too? And verse 16, Ruth says, don't urge me to leave or turn back from following you, for where you go, I'll go, and where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death separates you and me. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So they allowed her to go back. This is where she's a woman of excellence, a virtuous woman. And she goes back, and when she gets back, they said, oh, isn't this Naomi? Which means sweetness or sweet. And she says, no, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has witnessed against me, and El Shaddai has afflicted me. God has turned his back on me. And so here they are back in Bethlehem. Again, there's no means of provision. It was to be a widow without any children was a very difficult place to be. You have no means of protection, no means of shelter, no means of provision. But chapter 2 opens and says, Naomi had a kinsman. Now, this word kinsman is another key word that you see in the book of Ruth. It's translated a variety of ways: kinsman, close relative. But it carries another idea with it. It's called a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer is one who's a close relative who is now supposed to assume some of the responsibilities of care. And so Naomi says, well, there is a kinsman, and his name's Boaz. He was from the family of Elimelech, and so Ruth says, well, let me go into the fields and let me glean. That was what widows did. They went into the fields to pick up what was essentially dropped by the reapers. And so she goes into the field to glean so that they have food. And you get to verse 3, it says she departed and went and gleaned in the field and the reapers. And it just so happened, she came to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the family of Elimelech. Wow, coincidence. She ends up in Boaz's field. And Boaz sees her and says, who is this woman? I don't know her. And they say, well, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law. And so he says, well, make sure she's taken care of. Make sure she's protected. Make sure that no harm comes to her. Make sure that she is able to glean and have enough food. So he is assuming a role of looking out for her. Ruth goes home and says, hey, got stuff? And Naomi says, well, how come? How were you so safe? She said, well, there's this man named Boaz. And Naomi says, well, that's the kinsman. That's the relative. And so he has a responsibility. And so Naomi gives her instructions and says, look, it's the end of the harvest. You go down there at night, and Boaz had a good harvest, apparently, and so they were celebrating that harvest, and he was fully satisfied. He laid down to go to sleep, and the plan was to go and lay at his feet and take his blanket or his robe or what is covering and to pull it over you. Now, let me just explain something, because there are some who might look at this and say, well, wait a minute, is this saying that Naomi told her to go and basically have a sexual relationship with Boaz? And the answer is no, there was nothing sexual in this at all. One of the reasons I know it's not sexual is because when all done, Boaz says, you are a woman of virtue. That's not what a woman of virtue would do. But it was a custom that says, look, when you take that cover and you pull that cover over, what she was saying is, I'm under your protection. I'm looking for you to be my covering, my protection. And that sounds like a good idea and a good plan, except there's one thing that they didn't know, Naomi and Ruth weren't aware of. And that is, there's actually a kinsman, a relative who was closer than Boaz. And it was his responsibility first. And so Boaz goes to the man and he says, look, are you interested in the land, or the piece of land that was Elimelech's farm? Are you interested in redeeming that? And the man says, yes, I want to redeem that. He goes, great. One condition. If you redeem the land, you got to redeem Ruth too. And he says, I can't do that. I'm unable to do that. For whatever reasons, he doesn't able to do that. And so, but the city leaders, the elders of the city, they sit there, and it's a legal transaction now, a civil transaction. The man says, I can't do this. He takes off his shoe, which is another means of transferring that responsibility. So he gives it, and he says, look, I'm not taking the responsibility. I'll allow Boaz to take that responsibility. And so Boaz does. And Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. And you get to the end of chapter 4, and the elders said, we're witnesses. May the Lord make the women who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth, become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. And so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the women said to Naomi, now, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer. You thought God had turned his back on you, but the Lord has now provided you a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of old age. In verse 16, Naomi takes the child, lays him on her lap, becomes his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. And he's the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so Naomi's provided for, and Ruth and Boaz get married and live happily ever after. Is that what the story's about? No. It's about God's work in providing a redeemer. God's work at doing things in a way that sometimes we don't see. You see, when I come back to the statement of Naomi in chapter 1, the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. It reminds me of my own life. It reminds me of how sometimes I perceive life. I have a very limited perspective. What I see and how I judge things is by where I stand in time, and also what is my experience at that time. And so Naomi is standing in time. She looks at her life and says, wow, my life right now it can't get any worse. I feel like God has turned his back on me. So at the day in her personal life, in her personal history, in her personal perspective, she thinks that's God is no longer working in her life. Far be it from the truth. That's not true. God is at work. God is at work. And he's doing it in a way that you don't understand. It isn't always visible. And neither is the work of God only concerned with you or me at my point in time. God's work is a work that involves my life, but it involves not just my personal history, but it involves all of history and redemptive history. God is at work. Now, what do I see this here? Well, it just so happened that Ruth ends up in Boaz's field. Really? You see, when I get to the end there in chapter 4, the statement that may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring, and then through your son Obed is going to come Jesse, who's the father of David. It tells me God is at work in history in accomplishing his purpose, and sometimes where I don't really understand it. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Do you remember at Christmas time, we dealt with Matthew chapter 1, and we'll go back to Matthew 1 in a minute, but in Matthew chapter 1, in the genealogy of Jesus, we talked about Tamar and Judah. Tamar was not Judah's wife. Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law, who Judah's son didn't have a child by Tamar, and he died. And so Judah gave him another son who disobeyed. He said, I'm not going to do this. And God took his life. No child. Judah says, I'll promise you my third son, which he never did. He never fulfilled his promise. And so Tamar deceived him. Deceived him by his own sinfulness. And she conceives and bears a son. Actually, two. Twins. But Perez. Judah is given a promise that the scepter will not depart from Judah. So it's a promise that says, look, that the line of a king, when Israel has a king, the line of the king is going to come through Judah. Well, it does, but which son of Judah? Well, Perez. Perez, who was conceived in a way that wouldn't have been the way I would have done it. And Perez is the ancestor of Boaz. And Boaz marries Ruth and has a child who becomes the grandfather of David. God is working in history. Listen, Perez, Obed, and those other people in between, Ram, Hezron, Amminadab, and all those other Nashon, they're not flyover people. They're not non-important people. Without them, there's no David. Now, you see, listen, there is no king in Israel. Remember from Judges? It's repeated. There is no king in Israel. There is no king in Israel. Every man does what's right in his own eyes. There is no king in Israel. What was God's answer for that? The answer was a king. Who's the king? David. David, who's the descendant of Judah. We'll look at 1 Samuel in a couple of weeks. Saul was not a descendant of Judah. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. He was not a rightful king. The king of God's choosing was a descendant of Judah through Perez, through Boaz, and Ruth. God is accomplishing his purposes to bring about David. And here's Naomi. God has turned his back on me. No, he hadn't. God's working. And it's more than just you, Naomi. God is working to accomplish a purpose for the nation of Israel. And you know, your word about a kinsman redeemer for you. You know what's interesting about David? David, in many ways, becomes a true kinsman redeemer. David is the one, because of his exploits and because he's honoring God and God is with him. It says in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that God gives the nation and David rest from his enemies. He redeems Israel. David is a redeemer king. But David's nothing compared to David's greater son. You see, when you go to that genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, and it repeats this genealogy here in Ruth chapter 4, but it continues on because it's not just to get to David. We're told that this goes on to Jesus. Jesus is David's greater son. And Jesus is a kinsman redeemer even greater than David. David may have given rest to the people of Israel from their enemies, but Jesus redeems us in such a way that he gives us rest from the victory of sin and death and hell. That's what we sang, by the way, a little bit ago. He gives us victory over the greatest enemies. He gives us rest over that. He's our kinsman redeemer. He's one who became one like us to provide that rest. Here's Naomi saying, you know, God has turned his back on me. No, he hasn't, Naomi. God is at work in ways that you don't see. God is using you, Naomi, in ways that you can't imagine. Naomi, through what God is doing in your life and going back to Bethlehem and introducing Ruth to Boaz, is going to come David, and later is going to come Jesus. You see, where I stand in time, I can only see where I am at the moment. And I judge God by what I see and what I think at the moment in my personal history, in that personal slice in time, and my personal experiences. And God is not limited to me. God is working, and even through the difficulties of my experiences, God is working to accomplish a greater purpose. I didn't come from anywhere, just out of a vacuum, and you didn't either. You know that? God has been working in your personal life through your parents and your grandparents, your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and great-great... Name them. Keep going back as far as you can go. Do you understand? God, in order to prepare you, was working in their life, however and whatever he wanted to do years and years and years and years ago. And here's the good news. Your life is not the end of it either. God gives you children and grandchildren. How that continues, God preparing for what he has yet in future time to accomplish his work. Whether or not you're in your workplace, the things that you do at work, do you understand? God is using you in ways that you cannot see to accomplish his purpose. And his purpose is to bring about his purpose in history, which is a redemptive purpose. Turn to Isaiah 59. It's just one of the things that's beautiful about this is a reminder. When I look at this kinsman redeemer and the purposes of God, and I see this being played out in Jesus. And I look at the people who were there. I look at Naomi and I look at Ruth and I say, what is it about there that I also learned something about the purposes of God and this redemptive purpose and plan of God, who it includes. When I come to Isaiah 59, It's this wonderful statement. It says that God looked and saw that there was no man, verse 16. There was no one to intercede, and so God did something himself. God becomes a redeemer himself. And he puts on the righteousness like a breastplate and the helmet of salvation, and he takes vengeance in order to accomplish rest on behalf of his people. In verse 19, they'll fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun from the east, and he'll come like a rushing stream. A redeemer. You know what that word redeemer is? It's the same word in the Book of Ruth. A close relative. A kinsman. That kinsman redeemer is going to come. And those who turn from transgression to Jacob, declares the Lord, and he makes his covenant with them. That's Jesus. And he makes his covenant not just with the important people. How do I know that? Because Naomi was a widow. She's a poor woman. She's defenseless, helpless. God redeems the helpless. God has a plan to redeem those who are the defenseless, to give them rest from their enemies. And there's Ruth, who's from Moab. That means God has a plan for those outside of Israel. He redeems those who are the strangers, those who are the aliens, those who are the foreigners, those who we have no claim like everybody. He redeems them too. The nations. God's plan of redemption. And what he does in working in the life of a solitary woman to redeem her, to redeem her daughter-in-law, but to redeem Israel, to redeem the nations. That's what God's doing. That perspective was so narrow. You know, sometimes that's how we judge our lives in the present. Sometimes we look at our life in the present and you say, man, God's turned his back. God's not doing what I think. And yes, he is. He's just not doing it the way you want him to do it. He's not doing it the way you think he should do it. He's not doing it in the time you think he should do it. And so I often come back to this. This has become almost a poem of my life that I quote to you so often. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea, and he rides upon the storm. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense. Trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, what seems like chance, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. That bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. There you see it in the Book of Ruth. I'd never look at the Book of Ruth, a wonderful love story, but it's more than that. It's a love story of a God who's working and redeeming even when we can't see it. Listen, you may have unbelieving family members, and you're asking God, you know what, he may be at work in ways you don't see it. You may have unbelieving coworkers. God may be using you in ways you don't know. Years ago, I had a lady come to me. She was Armenian. Armenian. And she had married a gentleman who was Catholic. And she had grown up around where Barb grew up. There was a large Armenian Apostolic Church, and that's where Alice had grown up and gone to church. Mark, on the other hand, had grown up in New Jersey. He was Catholic. She'd married. They were living in New Jersey. And so they're raising their children in the Catholic Church. And she came to me one day and she said, hey, my kids are going to confirmation class and they're saying this. They say my church doesn't believe that Jesus really was a man. Is that true? I said, Alice, let me explain to you. This is what's going on. And then she said, well, what about all this and saints and this and that? And so I explained to Alice, I got the opportunity to talk to Alice and take her to Matthew 16 and work through Matthew 16 and understand what was important was about believing that Jesus Christ, the Son of God. A couple of years later, I got a letter from her husband. I had met Mark on 2 occasions. I'd never had a significant conversation with Mark. All I had done was meet him at a party and talk briefly and casual talk and move on to somebody else. Mark sent me a letter. He said, I just want to let you know. He said, Alice came home and told me what you told her 2 years ago. He said, and I've thought about that and thought about that. He said, I've become a Christian. I put my faith and trust in Christ. I never told him the gospel. You mean he became a believer without me telling him the gospel? How dare he? God is at work, and he uses you, and he's at work in your life in ways that you just sometimes don't always understand. I look at the afflictions, I look at the difficulties and say, God, you use them too? Yes. Don't be Mara. Don't be bitter. Let your life be Naomi, sweet with the joy of what the love of God is doing redemptively in your life and in the lives of those around you.